Hello, everyone. So I'm Nancy Wolanski. I'm the director of the Alliance for Nonprofit Impact at United Way. And I wanted to acknowledge that the world is in turmoil right now and wanted to acknowledge the emotional roller coaster many of us have been on the last few days with some of the things coming out from DC and the war in Iran, and just recognize that it is exhausting and obviously incredibly concerning to hear some of the things that are coming from the White House. So we're not gonna talk about the war and issues related to that, but I just wanted to start from the place that I think all of us are kind of reeling from some of the things going on. That said, those of you who joined a little bit late, I am at a conference, and so I'm in a corner. If you have issues with sound, just let me know. It's a little hard for me to see, so just unmute if you have any issues. And I think Robin can put the policy briefing document in the chat that we're going to go over. It has a lot more detail on some of the things that I'm going to talk about, but you'll have that for reference. So we're going to start on the federal side of things and then touch on a few state issues and then have time for you to ask any questions. The biggest thing right now impacting nonprofits here in Rhode Island directly from the federal government is that the budget process is starting up again, and partially because of what is going on in Iran, and partially just because of this administration's priorities. We are seeing the administration say what they want for the next budget to be really focused on the military, and that means they are requesting significant cuts to non-defense spending. The FY26 budget, we know that most of the appropriations bills passed, except for the DHS, Department of Homeland Security, appropriations bill. So they have been in a shutdown for 51 days now. It is the longest shutdown in history for a government agency. The Senate passed a bipartisan bill to reopen most of DHS, including TSA and FEMA and cybersecurity, but the House did not approve that before they went on recess. So the president said that he was directing DHS just to go ahead and pay TSA agents. That there's been questions raised about whether he has the authority to do that, whether there are accounts that have money in them that are legitimately allowed to pay for those salaries. I mean, the thing to remember is that ICE and Customs and Border Patrol are not getting FY26 budgetary funding, but they have plenty of money to operate because they were given such a large appropriation through the reconciliation bill last year. So they are operating as they want to, but they have not been funded through this FY26 appropriations bill. So that is the piece that needs to get finished. And I don't know there are mixed messages about whether that is going to get done when they return from recess or not, or how quickly it will be. There is one of the caveats, one of the reasons that the Senate was able to pass the compromise was that there was an assumption that after the DHS budget passed, they would have a Republican-only reconciliation bill go through, which would fund the parts of Homeland Security that the Democrats don't want to fund, that would cut further Medicaid and SNAP, and also include the SAVE Act, which is the voter registration and voter identification bill that is a priority for President Trump. So the idea would be that the Republicans in the Senate would put together a reconciliation bill to include all of those pieces that would then pass with just Republican votes. It wouldn't need to have a 60 vote majority. There is an issue with some of those things because the parliamentarian has to rule that everything included in a reconciliation bill relates to the budget, and there may be issues about whether the SAVE Act, because it deals with voter registration and voter identification, whether that actually has any budgetary implications. So that may make it difficult for them to include that into a reconciliation bill. But the upshot of all of that is that with what is happening in Iran and the potential for this other reconciliation bill, there is the prospect of continued cuts into social service programs. So the budget for FY27 that the administration released includes a 10% reduction in non-defense discretionary spending. So that's not entitlement programs like Social Security, which is we've really kind of cut the pieces of the budget that they want to cut. And now they're going to be looking for significant cuts still in order to mitigate a significant increase in defense spending. So the Trump administration is proposing to eliminate LIHEAP, the Energy Assistance Program, completely, to eliminate community service block grants, the Refugee Resettlement Program, unaccompanied immigrant children, and FEMA non-disaster grant programs. Would also eliminate the Home Investment Partnerships Program, homeless assistance programs, and the Fair Housing Initiatives programs. So, among other things. So it's really concerning about the administration saying our priority is military and we're going to cut all of these other programs. The lots of different homeless assistance programs in addition to the ones that I just read, and additional hoops, which in essence cut eligibility for existing programs like public housing. So the important thing to remember is that the president's budget is just a suggestion. It is essentially his wish list, and it goes to Congress, which actually makes the budget. So they can start from what the president suggests, or they can completely disregard what the president suggests. The president's budget also includes revenue numbers that are not realistic, because it is showing that tariffs are going to bring in all this revenue, and they projected that before the Supreme Court struck down a lot of the tariffs, and also predicting that economic growth is going to be 50% higher than the Congressional Budget Office projection. So they are looking for those kinds of numbers to be able to offset their increased expenses from military spending as well as from the cost of the tax cuts from the previous reconciliation bill. So essentially, we know where the administration's priorities are. They've articulated that, they've shown it in their budget document. And so now it's time for Congress to begin the appropriations process and to make its own decisions. Last year, we saw Congress come in at much more realistic figures for a lot of these programs and didn't cut some of the programs that the administration had advised to be cut. So that is a good thing, but we just have to see how influential the hardliners are, particularly in the House, saying that they want to have significant cuts to the overall budget. which would then trickle down into the individual agency budgets. So that's kind of where things stand overall with the budget. The House is a little bit further along in the appropriations process. They have received all of the requests from individual members. So that includes the discretionary spending or earmarks that have already gone in. That process was closed mid-March. The Senate process is closing mid-April, well, April 20th, about between the 13th to the 20th, depending on which subcommittee it is. And so they are about a month behind on the Senate side. But so now essentially all the requests have gone in, and now it goes to appropriation staff and committee members to do the crunching to actually assemble a budget. Remember, their goal is to have these appropriations bills passed by the end of the federal budget year, which is September 30th. Last year, they didn't, which is why we started the shutdown in October last year. But that is what the goal is for the budget process. So, any questions about the budget? Thanks, Bill, for putting this in the chat. Jim?
Nancy,
Yeah.
just a question that is one of the projected cuts to the CSBG Community Service Block Grant Program or the Community Development Block Grant Program?
Development.
Okay.
Community Development Block Grant. Yep.
Thanks.
Bill?
Thanks, Daisy. Just wanted to add to that, based on an email that we had received from the Corporation for Supportive Housing yesterday, it sounds like the other really concerning thing is not just the budget cuts, but how funds are being allocated. It sounds like, at least related to HUD, the Trump administration is proposing to shift funds from the legally required funding to discretionary funding, so that HUD is better able to make funding decisions that align with the Trump administration values. So we'll see we'll potentially be looking at a shift from things like permanent supportive housing and housing first, transitional housing and treatment first programs. So there's also that kind of ideological values aspect to how they're proposing the budget.
Yeah, which would give them a lot more flexibility if they were able to remove it from statutory requirements to discretionary. Thanks for bringing that up. Anything else about the budget? So now is in essence the time, if you have input on the budget, it is still open on the Senate side, and we have one senator, Senator Reed, who is on the Appropriations Committee. So any feedback that you want to direct to his office, you can weigh in there. I wanted to give an update on some congressional issues. There's been legislation introduced to increase charitable giving by allowing seniors to make qualified charitable distributions from their IRAs directly to a donor-advised fund, so that then they could distribute it to nonprofits. So that has been introduced. It's a bipartisan bill. There's also been legislation introduced to revoke tax-exempt status from any nonprofit that accepts international gifts from adversary countries. So that would be designated by the Treasury Secretary. And so that has been, there was previously a bill introduced that would prohibit quote unquote foreign nationals from serving on nonprofit boards if they are from one of the adversary countries. Problematic, because obviously, how do you determine whether that person should be kind of in that adversary category? And so that was a previous bill that was introduced. The Senate passed the Road to Housing legislation, which is the first time in decades that they have passed a significant piece of housing legislation, but it faces an uncertain path in the House. President Trump has said he supports it, but the it's not a priority for them. So there's a question of what will happen next. It would reduce some barriers and encourage the building of housing, which is obviously a good thing. But we need to wait and see what will happen on the House side. The SAVE Act, which is the voter registration bill, passed in the House, and they have not been able to advance it in the Senate at this point, but it remains a priority for the administration. So that's why they're thinking of other routes to implement it, potentially either through the reconciliation bill or through executive orders, but it's unclear that that would be legal to do that through an executive order. There was a study on the impact of the last year's reconciliation bill that made some changes to what is available for charitable donations. And it shows that nonprofits are estimated to lose $5.7 billion annually as a result of the changes to particularly the corporate incentives for charitable deduction. So there's a link in the document to that study from University of Indiana or Indiana University, which is going to be part of what we are obviously going to be advocating to make changes in moving forward, because we don't want to see that happening. There is a continued effort on the part of the administration to tie policy and philosophical priorities of the administration to funding. And we have seen this in the past with different grant applications requiring applicants to certify that they don't, support illegal immigration or promote gender ideology, those kinds of things. Several of them have been thrown out by the courts, which is great, but the government is now trying an end around to that process of including certification with the SAM process. So that's the number that you have to get, the System for Award Management, the number you have to get in order to receive any kind of federal funding, whether you're a nonprofit or a for-profit. And so they want to include the certification requirement at that stage so that everyone who receives any kind of government funding or contract would have to do a certification. They just had a comment process, and we had more than 1,300 organizations sign on to a National Council of Nonprofits letter, and also 22,000 people submitted comments to the regulatory portal, which is fabulous. Now they have to go through the public comments, and then essentially the regulation moves to Office of Management and Budget. That will have a second comment period. So those of you who submitted comments, we would like you to submit them again once that comment period opens. So I'll be sending out information about how you can submit comments in the OMB portal. But it's really concerning because the certification requirements are really vague. It's really hard to know whether you're in compliance, and you would have to spend a lot if you're accused of violating the conditions. You would have to spend lots and lots of money defending yourself, even if you were eventually vindicated. So we are really trying actively to work and get that. I'm sure it will be litigated if it becomes an actual regulation, but it would be better if they just didn't implement it. They have also released an executive order that targets federal contractors. So again, executive orders are not law. They are instructions from the White House about how they would like to see laws implemented. But if they come into conflict with an existing law, they will get challenged in court and would get thrown out because they do not have the force of law. In any case, the president signed an executive order to prohibit DEI what they call DEI discrimination by federal contractors. And so it was essentially a certification process for federal contractors. So we're seeing, again, the same issues arising in any venue that they can attach it to, trying to promote their philosophy there. So you all are going to be much more impacted by the SAM issue because most of you are getting grants versus being a vendor, but we're seeing it kind of across the board. We're also seeing an increase in investigations of nonprofits. President Trump signed an executive order to establish the task force to eliminate fraud, and he put JD Vance in charge of it. They are supposed to be identifying recommendations to stop fraud in government benefit programs before June 14th. And they are also, the FBI and the IRS have a new initiative to investigate nonprofits over suspected possible links to domestic terrorism. So it's all concerning across the board, but I just wanted to make you aware of that. There have been several steps taken by the Department of Education and Treasury. They're moving student loan programs out of the auspices of the Department of Education. Some of it is going into the Small Business Administration, and some of the Treasury is going to be working with. So it's a part of the effort to dismantle the Department of Education. So they're taking pieces out. There's more information in the document, but there's been significant movement there. There are several cases. Oh, sorry. So anything about the executive branch issues. Oh, the last thing is that there is a ADA Title II website accessibility regulation, which is really focused for state and local governments to ensure that their websites are ADA accessible, but it also can impact organizations that provide services on behalf of federal or state governments. And so if your state contract is kind of providing a service that includes a website, there's information in the briefing document because there's an April 24th deadline for you to have your website comply with ADA regulations. So that's not going to apply to all nonprofits, but some of you that may apply to. Bill.
Yeah, question on the increase in investigation for fraud. Do you have any idea of like how those claims have been found? Is this whistleblower stuff, or is Trump? I know the Trump administration, I think in December or January, indicated that the GAO or whoever was going to be targeting 14 blue-leaning states and for like really thorough investigations of use of federal funds. Do you know if this is one or both of those?
So that investigation is specifically on state administration of benefits. So it's not necessarily the nonprofits involved, but there are similar trickle-down effects from some of those state level investigations. So there is blue-red distinction in terms of how they are going proceeding with the investigations. Some of it there have been investigations, particularly on the immigration side, that were related to organizations who actually received funding under the Biden administration for immigration and refugee related services. So they were able to just kind of look at, okay, who received money from the Biden administration. We think the Biden administration, quote unquote, promoted illegal immigration. And so we're going to look like that's the pool of folks that we're going to start investigating. And they didn't announce investigations to every nonprofit that received funding, but that was kind of the pool that they were drawing from. There have also been on the domestic terrorism front, they have looked at environmental organizations and organizations that they say have funded the protests in different cities. And so they are claiming that that means that if they were involved or supportive in any way of protests, then that would show that they support quote unquote domestic terrorism. And so those are kind of the buckets that they have looked at so far. That doesn't mean there have been, I think, a handful of them that have been kind of whistleblower related, but I do not think that's the majority. I think that it's been these buckets that they are looking at, and then they're kind of narrowing down. My guess is they're doing AI searches of things, and that's again another tool that they're using. Any other questions? Okay. In terms of litigation, there have been some good court decisions about dismissing grant requirements related to DEI. In Illinois, there was one that prevented the agency, Department of Justice, from requiring DEI certification. And so that also impacts like victims of human trafficking program. There were also the First Circuit of Court of Appeals rejected the unlawful limits on homelessness funds, which some of you have been involved in. There was also the district court, and that was the Rhode Island case, also ruled that you can't deny funding because a jurisdiction has a policy that the administration doesn't like. There's a coalition of state attorneys general who filed a lawsuit in March challenging new conditions on USDA grants. And again, it's the same certification issues, but it is the Democratic state AGs who are challenging now seeing that happen on USDA grants. So we've consistently seen litigation be successful on those, but it is sort of whack-a-mole because it's just coming up on so many different funding sources. Also, we have seen I think I've talked about the Johnson Amendment in previous calls, but the Johnson Amendment is the federal law that prohibits nonprofits from engaging in political campaigns and making statements in support or against political candidates. And it's really important to keep nonprofits nonpartisan. There was a lawsuit in Texas from two churches who said that it infringed on their freedom of speech. And the IRS submitted an amicus brief saying that it would not enforce the Johnson Amendment against churches. The court ended up throwing the case out because it said that the churches did not establish that they had harm in the case. And if they did have harm in the case, they could go to tax court. And so that particular case is not active any longer, although they are appealing it, but there was not a decision in that case. In response to the decision, the IRS and Department of Treasury have announced plans to do new guidance that would essentially achieve the same goal of allowing churches to be able to, in their normal course of worship, to be able to talk about political candidates. So it depends on how that is implemented as to whether there is a chance to weigh in. If it goes through a public process to create a new regulation, there will be a public comment process, but they may do it at kind of sub-level guidance that isn't official regulations. And in that case, it would be really difficult to challenge because it is not actual, it's just squishy because it's not an actual regulation. And so National Council of Nonprofits is monitoring it and will potentially, if it's appropriate, they would undertake litigation about it. But right now, the plaintiffs in the case are appealing the case being thrown out, and the IRS is planning to do guidance that would essentially say that they're not going to enforce this against churches, but it opens the door for it to impact nonprofits. We have had initial conversations at the state level with the Secretary of State's office about potentially doing a state level Johnson Amendment. And because the court case didn't have a decision, we're looking at that for next legislative term because the deadline has passed for submitting new General Assembly legislation. There are several other cases that are noted in the document about courts saying you can't terminate funding because you have a different political philosophy than an organization or a district, which is good news. There are also a court case that determined that the HHS secretary exceeded his authority in declaring gender affirming treatments unsafe. But at the same time, the Supreme Court rejected a law that banned conversion therapy. So kind of mixed messages on the litigation front for that. Any questions about litigation? Okay. On the state level, there's a couple things I just wanted to mention. Does anyone on the call use remote net metering? No? Okay. Or nonprofits who have agreements on alternative energy would be impacted by an issue in the state, in the governor's proposed budget that would reduce the savings that come from that. So just wanted to, if there was anyone here, we could talk a little bit about it. But there's also a bill being introduced by Representative Slater. It's H8349, which is proposing a study commission to study nonprofit tax exemptions, property tax exemptions, not just tax exemptions, but property tax exemption. We have been in conversation with Representative Slater. He basically feels like it's really inconsistent and unclear about how the law functions, and he would like to see how other states do it. And also he's concerned about the impact on municipalities with having a lot of property taken off the tax rolls, which is an ongoing issue for municipalities. We have been in conversation with him. He agreed to make a few modifications to the bill on our request. We asked that in addition to having 2 nonprofit representatives on the commission, that we also have a nonprofit attorney on the commission, because we don't want the nonprofits to be there without having the bulwark of having an attorney on there as well who represents nonprofits. We also asked that the biggest issue is that we asked for any recommendations to include a analysis of the impact, the potential impact of any recommendations on nonprofits, as well as on services available, so that they would have to have in front of them, if they're going to make any changes, for them to see this is what the impact of any changes would be. And then lastly, to extend the time period to enable that impact analysis to take place. So right now it was just going to be a 6-month commission, and we recommended a year. He said he would incorporate all of those requests into the legislation, which is great. For those of you who don't know, right now it's a real patchwork of how the property tax exemptions are implemented, because there are town processes involved, as well as state legislation, which itself isn't very clear. And then some nonprofits have their own statutes giving them personally a tax exemption in law. So there's like 50 nonprofits who have a statutory exemption by name, and then other nonprofits are kind of trying to navigate the system. And so on our end, what we would like to see is transparency and consistency, so that it's an equitable process for all nonprofits. We will, of course, would like all nonprofits to receive a property tax exemption. So that's what we are going to be advocating for. But we also want to make sure that it's a transparent and equitable process for all nonprofits. So wanted to let you know about that. We have also had some nonprofits report to us that they've received guidance from the Department of Revenue saying that while in the past, they have not required 1099s to be produced for any recipient who has less than that doesn't have Rhode Island taxes taken out of their payment under $600 would not be required to have a 1099. Their new guidance is that anyone who receives over $100 needs to have a 1099, retroactive to tax year 2025, which is a big headache for organizations who have already done all of your 1099s. You've already, and particularly for organizations that may be giving incentives, for participants in different things, so which may add up to $100 over the course of a year. The tracking of that when you didn't know that this was going to be a process, so you didn't have a process, as well as fears about folks who may not want to give their social security number or their contact information because for many reasons with this current environment. So we are in the process of trying to ask the Department of Revenue to not implement that, at least not implement that retroactively, because for you to have to track down anyone that you gave incentives to that ended up being over $100 for last year, we assume that everyone has already filed their taxes. And so then you have the individuals also having to amend their taxes because they didn't have a 1099, because they didn't know they needed a 1099, because you didn't know that they needed a 1099. So that is, we are in the midst of that, trying to investigate how we can get a blanket kind of exemption. I did talk to someone in the Department of Revenue's office who said, yeah, because we sent it out so late, it wouldn't be a problem to get an extension. And I was like, yeah, but that doesn't really solve the issue. And so we're trying to get some broader guidance available for nonprofits. So I will keep you posted on that, but I did want to make you aware of it. The guidance was dated in February, but the one nonprofit that brought it to my attention didn't receive it until March 30th. So that is a problem too. So the Rhode Island Society of CPAs is also going to be asking the Department of Revenue to not implement it, and they're going to also ask them to align their regulations with federal regulations. So it would just be the $600 threshold, consistent with what the federal regulation is. So we will join them and support that. I assume it's unclear as to whether it will need to require legislation, because right now the statute just says the Department of Revenue may require 1099s for over $100. It does not require them to require you to do a 1099 over 100. It just gives them the permission that they can. So it seems that we should be able to push back at the regulatory level versus having legislation, but the Society of CPAs will also be trying to work on that as well. So that's all I have. The briefing document does give some other action steps if you want to weigh in and give comments on different things. There are a bunch of links in the document that you can use if you want to take action on anything. Does anyone have any questions? No? Okay, then you'll get some time back in your day. I hope that was helpful. And please let me know if there's any way that I or the Alliance can be helpful moving forward. Okay. Thanks.